Finally, let's try and consider what makes or breaks a literature review. I will start with the half-empty part of the glass, the common mistakes in reviewing the literature. One is not considering contradictory findings and alternative interpretation. Most of the literature reviews are expected to be critical in nature, and the critical literature review looks at differences in opinion, differences in findings. So it's not enough to look at a particular relationship in a particular direction. You need to seek to look at that relationship from the exact opposite point of view. Surely somebody argued something very different. And once you've done that, you need to try and investigate why the findings are different. Perhaps the methods are different, or the environment in which the research was conducted varied. And it is important for you to demonstrate that you are able to engage in such an exploration. Another common mistake with any literature review, either produced by students or by experienced academics, is uncritically accepting other researchers' findings as valid without critically examining the way in which that research was conducted. So just looking at issues of validity, of reliability, again, just trying to see what makes different findings relating to the same relationship of variables different. And finally, this is a very important one for me, not clearly relating the extant literature, so what was done before you, with your intended contribution. Remember, we said that research is a process, and what you aim to do in your dissertation is just add one building block into that process. Now, it is important that you, through your literature review, you explain the configuration of the bricks before your brick is added. So it's not enough to just tell us what Smith and Dudo and Langsfield and Fishbacher did. It's important that you tell us what we didn't do, or what we didn't do in that particular way in which you want to do it, or in that particular environment in which you want to do it. So it is very important that at the very end of your literature review, you have a section on gap in knowledge or gap in literature and expected contribution. Now, what does a good literature review look like? To start with, it contains key papers, seminal literature in the area of interest. Now, it depends on the area of interest, very much depends on that, and they could be very recent papers or rather old papers. I think it's more common than not to have older pieces of work as seminal literature. How do you distinguish what is seminal? Well, to start with, it is likely that somebody who has undertaken a literature review in that field will have referred to those key literature studies, or they may be taught in your course, or in the context of you reading towards your literature review, you would have encountered a particular study a lot. That becomes a key study in that field, and you have to be referring to it. Your literature, a good literature review, especially in deductive research, especially when the aim of your literature review is to produce a theoretical framework which you then have to test with data, a good literature review provides that theoretical framework. Now, you have to remember that not all research is deductive, so very often this theoretical framework in relation to inductive research will look more like a background than a theory which needs to be tested. But this second point here regarding the theoretical framework refers to the need for you to synthesize the findings in the field, not just to tell us a story about what the findings are, but try to synthesize it into, as I said, schools of thoughts and clusters of opinions. A good literature review will provide the gist of the empirical findings in the area. Now, what is expected of your dissertation is to be an empirical investigation of any particular issue or relationship. Now, I know you will only be expected to use secondary data, but that is still used in empirical research. So you need to isolate from the literature reviewed in this literature review chapter the empirical findings. So what was found theoretically, what was found empirically. Then, especially with deductive research, you will need to identify variables identified by others before you as being important in the relationships you want to discuss as deriving from your research questions, your research objectives. A good literature review also gives a glimpse of the kind of methods and methodologies applied previously by previous researchers. For example, if everybody applies a deductive methodology and uses questionnaires, I would be very surprised if you didn't try to use the same methodology, or I would expect a very good explanation for you departing from that tradition and doing something differently. And you would do that in that last paragraph in your literature review, where you formulate the gaps in knowledge and your intended contribution. Finally, and this is what that paragraph is about, a good literature review outlines the gaps and avenues for future research. Mind you, you don't have to cover the entire gap that exists in the literature review. You only have to cover part of it. Now it's up to you if you want to identify the full gap and then pinpoint what within that locus you want to focus in, or if you only want to identify what you want to focus in and point out that it hasn't been done before. That is completely up to you. Now, it's hard to speak theoretically about what makes or breaks a literature review, and I did attempt to do that, but the best way in which you could do that is by looking at examples of good literature reviews. One example is a paper by Mitchell, which is in itself a literature review, and here it is for you. You will be able to access it through the link on this PowerPoint. So I'm not going to show it to you, but I am going to point out the fact that you are not expected to do a literature review of your dissertation. That your dissertation is not expected to be a literature review, but it will be expected to contain a literature review. So this particular article here by Mitchell is in itself a literature review, which may explain why it is a lot more elaborate than what you will be producing in your dissertation. An example, but however, it is a good example of a literature review. An example of a paper that you may be able to use better in relation to a literature review is done by myself in one of my articles. And the article is not in itself a literature review, it is an empirical investigation which has a literature review contained in it, placed right after an introduction, and bears the title of theoretical background, but essentially it is a literature review. And it ends with gaps in literature and the methodology of my proposed study. This is much more close to what you're expected to produce in your dissertation.